Part 3. Oz the Gweet and Tuwibble. Jesus therefore, groaning inside of himself and full of trouble, came to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone had been raised against the mouth. Roll away the stone, Jesus said. Martha said, Lord, by this time he will have begun to rot. He has been dead 4 days. And when he had prayed a while, Jesus raised his voice and cried, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus said to them, Loose him and let him go. John's Gospel, paraphrase, I only just thought of it, she said hysterically. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it? Think of what? He questioned. The other 2 wishes, she replied rapidly. We've only had one. Was that not enough? He demanded fiercely. No, she cried triumphantly. We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again. W. W. Jacobs, The Monkey's Paw. 58. Judd Crandall Cree awake with a sudden jerk, alone falling out of his chair. He had no idea how long he had slept. It could have been 15 minutes or 3 hours. He looked at his watch and saw that it was 5 minutes of 5. There was a feeling that everything in the room had been subtly shifted out of position, and there was a line of pain across his back from sleeping sitting up. Oh, you stupid old man, look what you gone and done. But he knew better, in his heart, he knew better. It wasn't just him. He hadn't simply fallen asleep on watch, he had been put to sleep. That frightened him, but one thing frightened him more. What had awakened him? He was under the impression that there had been some sound, He held his breath, listening over the papery rustle of his heart. Here was a sound, not the same one that had awakened him, but something. The faint creak of hinges. Judd knew every sound in this house, which floorboards creaked, which stair levels squeaked, where along the gutters the wind was apt to hoot and sing when it was drunkenly high, as it had been last night. He knew this sound as well as any of those. The heavy front door, the one that communicated between his porch and the front hall, had just swung open. And with that information to go on, his mind was able to remember the sound that had awakened him. It had been the slow expansion of the spring on the screen door communicating between the porch and the front walk. Louis? He called, but with no real hope. That wasn't Louis out there. Whatever was out there had been sent to punish an old man for his pride and vanity. Footsteps moved slowly up the hall toward the living room. Louis? He tried to call again, but only a faint croak actually emerged because now he could smell the thing which had come into his house here at the end of the night. It was a dirty, low smell, the smell of poisoned tidal flats. Judd could make out bulking shapes in the gloom: Norma's armoire, the Welsh dresser, the highboy, but no details. He tried to get to his feet on legs that had gone to water, his mind screaming that he needed more time, that he was too old to face this again without more time. Timmy Batterman had been bad enough, and Judd had been young then. The swing door opened and let in shadows. One of the shadows was more substantial than the others. Dear God, that stink. Shuffling steps in the darkness. Gage? Judd gained his feet at last. From one corner of his eye he saw the roll of cigarette ash in the Jim Beam ashtray. Gage, is that why? A hideous mewling sound now arose, and for a moment all of Judd's bones turned to white ice. It was not Louis's son returned from the grave, but some hideous monster. No, it was neither. It was Church, crouched in the hall doorway, making that sound. The cat's eyes flared like dirty lamps. Then his eyes moved in the other direction and fixed on the thing which had come in with the cat. Judd began to back up, trying to catch at his thoughts, trying to hold on to his reason in the face of that smell. Oh, it was cold, and here the thing had brought its chill with it. Judd rocked unsteadily on his feet. It was the cat, twining around his legs, making him totter. It was purring. Judd kicked at it, driving it away. It bared its teeth at him and hissed. Think, think, you stupid old man, it mayn't be too late, even yet it mayn't be too late. It's back, but it can be killed again. If you can only do it. If you can only think. He backed away toward the kitchen, and he suddenly remembered the utensil drawer beside the sink. There was a meat cleaver in that drawer. His thin shanks struck the swinging door that led into the kitchen and he pushed it open. The thing that had come into his house was still indistinct, but Judd could hear it breathing. He could see one white band swinging back and forth. There was something in that hand, but he could not make out what. The door swung back as he entered the kitchen, and Judd at last turned his back and ran to the utensil drawer. He jerked it open and found the cleaver's worn hardwood handle. He snatched it up and turned toward the door again. He even took a step or two toward it. Some of his courage had come back. Remember, it ain't a kid. It may scream or something when it sees you've got its number, it may cry. But you ain't gonna be fooled. You been fooled too many times already, old man. This is your last chance. The swing door opened again, but at first only the cat came through. Judd's eye followed it for a moment and then he looked up again. The kitchen faced east, and dawn's first light came in through the windows, faint and milky white. Not much light but enough. Too much. Gage Creed came in, dressed in his burial suit. Moss was growing on the suit's shoulders and lapels. Moss had fouled his white shirt. His fine blonde hair was caked with dirt. One eye had gone to the wall. It stared off into space with terrible concentration. The other was fixed on Judd. Gage was grinning at him. "Hello, Judd," Gage piped in a babyish but perfectly understandable voice. "I've come to send your rotten, stinking old soul straight to hell. You fucked with me once. Did you think I wouldn't come back sooner or later and fuck with you?" Judd raised the cleaver. "Come on and get your pecker out then, whatever you are. We'll see who fucks with who. Norma's dead, and there'll be no one to mourn you," Gage said. "What a cheap slut she was. She fucked every one of your friends, Judd. She let them put it up her ass. That's how she liked it best. She's burning down in hell, arthritis and all. I saw her there, Judd. I saw her there." I lurched 2 steps toward him, shoes leaving muddy tracks on the worn linoleum. It held one hand out in front of it as if to shake with him. The other hand was curled behind its back. "Dake with him." The other hand was curled behind its back. "Listen, Judd," it whispered, and then its mouth hung open. Norma's voice issued forth, bearing small milk teeth, and although the lips did not move, labbed at you. "We all loushed as you. How we law-ud. Stop it." The cleaver jittered in his hand. "We did it in our bed, Herc, and I did it with George, I did it. We did it in our bed, Herc, and I did it. One did it with George, I did it with all of them. I knew about your whores, but you never knew you married a whore, and how we loud bed, Judd. We rutted together and we la cattada aft that." "Stop it," Judd screamed. He sprang at the tiny, swaying figure in its dirty burial suit, and that was when the cat arrowed out of the darkness under the butcher block where it had been crouched. It was hissing, its ears laid back along the bullet of its skull, and it tripped Judd up just as neat as you please. The cleaver flew out of his hand. It skittered across the humped and faded linoleum, blade and handle swiftly changing places as it whirled. It struck the baseboard with a thin clang and slid under the refrigerator. Judd realized that he had been fooled again, and the only consolation was that it was for the final time. The cat was on his legs, mouth open, eyes blazing, hissing like a teakettle. And then Gage was on him, grinning a happy black grin, eyes moon-shaped, rimmed with red, and his right hand came out from behind his back, and Judd saw that what he had been holding when he came in was a scalpel from Lewis's black bag. Dear Jesus, Judd managed and put his right hand up to block the blow. And here was an optical illusion. Surely his mind had snapped because it appeared that the scalpel was on both sides of his palm at the same time. Then something warm began to drizzle down on his face, and he understood. "I'm gonna fuck with you, old man." The Gage thing chortled, blowing its poisoned breath in his face. "I'm gonna fuck with you. I'm gonna fuck with you all. I want." Judd flailed and got hold of Gage's wrist. Skin peeled off like parchment in his hand. The scalpel was yanked out of his hand, leaving a vertical mouth. "All I want." The scalpel came down again. And again. And again. 59. "Try it now, ma'am," the truck driver said. He was looking into the engine cavity of Rachel's rented car. She turned the key. The Chevette's engine roared into life. The truck driver slammed the hood down and came around to her window. wiping his hands on a big blue handkerchief. He had a pleasant, ruddy face. A Dissert's truck stop cap was tilted back on his head. "Thank you very much," Rachel said, on the verge of tears. "I just didn't know what I was going to do." "Ah, a kid could have fixed that," the trucker said. "But it was funny. Never seen something like that go wrong on such a new car, anyway." "Why? What was it?" "One of your battery cables come right off." "Wasn't nobody frigging with it, was there?" "No," Rachel said, and she thought again of that feeling she'd had, that feeling of running into the rubber band of the world's biggest slingshot. Must have jogged her loose just riding along, I guess. "But you won't have no more trouble with your cables anyway. I tightened 'em up real good." "Could I give you some money?" Rachel asked timidly. The trucker roared with laughter. "Not me, lady," he said. "Us guys are the knights of the road, remember?" She smiled. "Well, thank you. More 'n welcome." He gave her a good grin, incongruously full of sunshine at this hour of the morning. Rachel smiled back and drove carefully across the parking lot the Feeds Road. She glanced both ways for traffic and 5 minutes later was back on the turnpike again, headed north. The coffee had helped more than she would have believed. She felt totally awake now, not the slightest bit dozy, her eyes as big as door knobs. That feather of unease touched her again, that absurd feeling that she was being manipulated. The battery cable coming off the terminal post like that. So she could be held up just long enough for. She laughed nervously. Long enough for what? For something irrevocable to boppin'. That was stupid, ridiculous. But Rachel began to push the little car along faster nonetheless. At 5 o'clock, as Judd was trying to ward off a scalpel stolen from the black bag of his good friend Dr. Lewis Creed, and as her daughter was awakening bolt upright in bed, screaming in the grip of a nightmare which she could mercifully not remember, Rachel left the turnpike, drove the Hammond Street cut-off close to the cemetery where a spade was now the only thing buried in her son's coffin, and crossed the Bangor Brewer Bridge. By 5:15, she was on Route 15 and headed for Ludlow. She had decided to go directly to Judd's. She would make good on at least that much of her promise. The Civic was not in their driveway, anyway, and although she supposed it might be in the garage, their house had a sleeping, unoccupied look. No intuition suggested to her that Lewis might be home. Rachel parked behind Judd's pickup and got out of the Chevette, looking around carefully. The grass was heavy with dew, sparkling in this clear, new light. Somewhere a bird sang and then was silent. On the few occasions since her pre-teenage years when she had been awake and alone at dawn without some responsibility to fulfill as the reason, she had a lonely but somehow uplifted feeling, paradoxical sense of newness and continuity. This morning she felt nothing so clean and good. There was only a dragging sense of unease which she could not entirely charge off to the terrible 24 hours just gone by her recent bereavement. Charge off to the terrible 24 hours just gone by and her. She mounted the porch steps and opened the screen door, meaning to use the old-fashioned bell on the front door. She had been charmed by that bell the first time she and Lewis came over together. You twisted it clockwise, and it uttered a loud but musical cry that was anachronistic and delightful. She reached for it now, then glanced down at the porch floor and frowned. There were muddy tracks on the mat. Looking around, she saw that they led from the screen door to this one. Very small tracks. A child's tracks, by the look of them. But she had been driving all night, and there had been no rain. Wind, but no rain. She looked at the tracks for a long time, too long, really, and discovered she had to force her hand back to the turn bell. She grasped it, and then her hand fell away again. I'm anticipating, that's all. Anticipating the sound of that bell in this stillness. He's probably gone to sleep after all and it will startle Bim awake. But that wasn't what she was afraid of. She had been nervous, scared in some deep and diffuse way ever since she had found it so hard to stay awake, but this sharp fear was something new. Some ching which had solely to do with those small tracks. Tracks that were the size. Her mind tried to block this thought, but it was too tired, too slow, of Gage's feet. Oh, stop it, can't you stop it? She reached out and twisted the bell. Its sound was even louder than she remembered, but not so musical. It was a harsh, choked scream in the stillness. Rachel jumped back, uttering a nervous little laugh that had absolutely no humor in it at all. She waited for Judd's footsteps, but his footsteps did not come. There was silence and more silence, and she was beginning to debate in her own mind whether or not she could bring herself to twist that iron butterfly shape again, when a sound did come from behind the door, a sound she would not have avenue expected in her wildest surmises. Wow wool, wow, wow, church, she asked, startled and puzzled. She bent forward, it was of course impossible to see in. The door's glass pane had been covered with a neat white curtain. Norma's work. Church, is that you? Rachel tried the door. It was unlocked. Church was there, sitting in the hallway with its tail coiled neatly around its feet. The cat's fur was streaked with something dark. Mud, Rachel thought, and then saw that the beads of liquid caught in Church's whiskers were red. He raised one paw and began to lick it, his eyes never leaving her face. Judd? She called out, really alarmed now. She stepped just inside the door. The house gave back no answer, only silence. Rachel tried to think, but all at once images of her sister Zelda had begun to creep into her mind, blurring thought. How her hands had twisted. How she used to slam her head against the wall sometimes when she was angry. The paper had been all torn there, the plaster beneath torn and broken. This was no time to think of Zelda, not when Judd might be hurt. Suppose he had fallen down? He was an old man. Think about that, not about the dreams you had as a kid, dreams of appending the closet and having Zelda spring out at you with her blackened, grinning face, dreams of being in the bathtub and seeing Zelda's eyes peer furnace, dreams ing out of the drain, dreams of Zelda lurking in the basement behind the Waru. Again, Church opened his mouth, exposing his sharp teeth and cried Lewis was right, we never sabold bave bad bim fixed, bees never samed right since then. But Lewis said it would take away all of his aggressive instincts. He was wrong about that, anyway. Church still bunts. He stares. Wah! Church cried again, then turned and darted up the Judd? She called again. Are you up there? Wow! Church cried from the top of the stairs, as if to confirm the fact, and then he disappeared down the hall. How did Bee get in, anyway? Did Judd let Bim in? Why? Rachel shifted from one foot to the other, wondering what to do next. The worst of it was that all of it seemed somehow managed, as if something wanted her to be here, and then there was a groan from upstairs, low and filled with pain. Judd's voice, surely Judd's voice. He's fallen in the bathroom or maybe tripped, broken a leg, or sprained bis bip. Maybe, the bones of the old are brittle. And what in the name of God are you thinking of, girl? Standing down beer and shifting back and forth like you had to go to the bathroom. That was blood on Church, blood. Judd's Bert and you're just standing beer. What's wrong with you, Judd? The groan came again, and she ran up the stairs. She had never been up here before, and because the hall's only window faced west, toward the river, it was still very dark. The hallways ran straight and wide beside the stairwell and toward the back of the house, the cherrywood rail gleaming with mellow elegance. There was a picture of the Acropolis on the wall and, it's Zelda all these years SB's been after you and now it's beer time open the right door and she'll be there with beer bumped and twisted back smelling of piss and death it's Zelda it's her time and finally she caught up with you. The groan came again. Low, from behind the second door on the right. Rachel began to walk toward that door, her heels clacking on the boards. It seemed to her that she was going through some sort of warp. Not a time warp or a space warp but a size warp. She was getting smaller. The picture of the Acropolis was floating higher and higher, and that cut glass doorknob would soon be at eye level. Her hand stretched out for it, and before she could even touch it, the door was snatched open. Zelda stood there. She was hunched and twisted, her body so cruelly deformed she had actually become a dwarf, little more than 2 feet high, and for some reason Zelda was wearing the suit they had buried Gage in. But it was Zelda, all right, her eyes alight with an insane glee, her face a rattled purple. It was Zelda screaming, finally came back for you. Rachel, I'm going to twist your back like mine and you'll never get out of bed again, never get out of bed again, never get out of bed again. Church was perched on one of her shoulders and Zelda's face swam and changed. and Rachel saw with spiraling, sickening horror that it really wasn't Zelda at all. How could she have made such a stupid mistake? It was Gage. His face was not black but dirty, smeared with blood. And it was swollen, as if he had been terribly hurt and then put back together again by crude, uncaring hands. She cried his name and held her arms out. He ran to her and climbed into them, and all the time one hand remained behind his back, as if with a bunch of posies picked in someone's back. "I brought you something, Mommy," he screamed. "I brought you something, Mommy. I brought you something, I brought you something." 60 Louis Greed woke up with the sun blazing full in his eyes. He tried to get up and grimaced at the stab of pain in his back. It was huge. He fell back on the pillow and glanced down at himself. Still fully dressed. Christ. He lay there for a long moment, steeling himself against the stiffness that had settled into every muscle, and then he sat up. "Oh, shit," he whispered. For a few seconds the room seesawed gently but perceptibly. His back throbbed like a bad tooth, and when he moved his head, it felt as if the tendons in his neck had been replaced by rusty bandsaw blades. But his knee was really the worst. The Ben Gay hadn't done a thing for it. He should have given himself a fucking cortisone shot. His pants were drawn tightly against the knee by the swelling. It looked like there was a balloon under there. "Really jobbed it," he muttered. "Boy, oh boy, did I ever." He bent it very slowly so he could sit on the edge of the bed. Lips pressed so rightly together they were white. Then he just how bad it really was, if it might be, began to flex it a bit, listening to the pain talk, trying to decide. Gage. Is Gage back? That got him on his feet in spite of the pain. He lurched across the room like Matt Dillon's old sidekick Chester. He went through the door and across the hall into Gage's room. But the room was empty. He lumped down to Ellie's room, which was also highway, was also empty. But empty, and then into the spare room. That room, which faced there was a strange car across the road. Parked behind Judd's truck. So what? So a strange vehicle over there could mean trouble, that was so what? Louis drew the curtain aside and examined the vehicle more closely. It was a small blue car, a Chevette. And curled up on top of it, apparently sleeping, was Church. He looked for a long time before letting the curtain go. Judd had company, that was all. So what? And it was maybe too early to worry about what was or was not going to happen with Gage. Church hadn't come back until almost 1 o'clock, and it was only 9 o'clock now. 9 o'clock on a beautiful May morning. He would simply go downstairs and make some coffee, get out the heating pad and wrap it around his knee, and what's Church doing on top of that car? "Oh, come on," he said aloud and began to limp back down the hall. Cats slept anywhere and everywhere, it was the nature of the beast. Except Church doesn't cross the road anymore, remember? Forget it, he muttered and paused halfway down the stairs, which he was working his way down almost side saddle. Talking to himself, that was bad. That was. What was that thing in the woods last night? The thought came to him unbidden, making him tighten his lips the way the pain in his knee had done when he swung it out of bed. He had dreamed about the thing in the woods last night. His dreams of Disney World had seemed to blend naturally and with a deadly ease into dreams of that thing. He dreamed that it had touched him, spoiling all good dreams forever, rotting all good intentions. It was the Wendigo, and it had turned him into not just a cannibal but the father of cannibals. In his dream he had been in the cemetery again, but not alone. Bill and Timmy Batterman had been there. Judd had been there, looking ghostly and dead, holding his dog Spot on a clothes rope leash. Lester Morgan was there with Hanratty the bull on a length of car towing chain. Hanratty was lying on his side, looking around with a stupid, drugged fury. And for some reason Rachel was there too, and she'd had some sort of accident at the dinner table, spilled a bottle of catsup or maybe dropped a dish of cranberry jelly. Maybe, because her dress was splattered with red stains. And then, rising behind the deadfall to a titanic height, its skin a cracked reptilian yellow, its eyes great hooded fog lamps, its ears not ears at all but massive curling horns, was the Wendigo, a beast that looked like a lizard born of a woman. It pointed its horny, nailed finger at all of them as they craned their necks up and up to watch it. "Stop," he whispered and shuddered at the sound of his own voice. He would go out into the kitchen, he decided, and make himself breakfast just as if it were any ordinary day. A bachelor breakfast, full of comforting cholesterol. A couple of fried egg sandwiches with mayo and a slice of Bermuda onion on each one. He smelled sweaty and dirty and cruddy, but he would save the shower for later. Right now getting undressed seemed like too much work, and he was afraid he might have to get the scalpel out of his bag and actually cut the leg of the pants open in order to allow his bloated knee to escape. A hell of a way to treat good instruments, but none of the knives in the house would cut the heavy jeans fabric, and Rachel's sewing scissors certainly would not do the trick. But first, breakfast. So he crossed the living room and then detoured into the front entry and looked out at the small blue car in Judd's driveway. It was covered with dewfall, which meant it had been there for some time. Church was still on the roof, Burr not sleeping. He appeared to be staring right at Lewis with his ugly yellow-green eyes. Lewis stepped back hurriedly, as if someone had caught him pecking. He went into the kitchen, rattled out a frying pan, put it on the stove, got eggs from the fridge. The kitchen was bright and crisp and clear. He tried to whistle. A whistle would bring the morning into its proper focus, but he could not. Things looked right, but they weren't right. The house seemed dreadfully empty, and last night's work weighed on him. Things were wrong, awry, he felt a shadow hovering, and he was afraid. He limped into the bathroom and took a couple of aspirin with a glass of orange juice. He was working his way back to the stove when the telephone rang. He did not answer it immediately but turned and looked at it, feeling slow and stupid, a sucker in some game which he was only now realizing he did not understand in the least. Don't answer that, you don't want to answer that because that's the bad news, that's the end of the leash that leads around the corner and into the darkness, and I don't think you want to see what's on the other end of that leash, Lewis, I really don't think you do, so don't answer that phone, run now, the car's in the garage, get it in and take off. But don't answer that phone. He crossed the room and picked it up, standing there with one hand on the dryer as he had so many times before, and it was Irvin Goldman, and even as Irwin said hello, Lewis saw the tracks crossing the kitchen, small, muddy tracks, and his heart seemed to freeze in his chest, and he believed he could feel his eyeballs swelling in his head, starting from their sockets. He believed that if he could have seen himself in the mirror at that moment he would have seen a face out of a 17th-century painting of a lunatic asylum. They were Gage's tracks. Gage had been here, bad Ben beer in the night, and so where was he now? Eyes Irvin, Lewis. Lewis? Are you there? Hello? Hello, Irwin, he said, and already he knew what Irwin was bummed to say. He understood the blue car. He understood every thing. The leash going into the darkness. He was moving fast along it now, hand over hand. Ah, if he could drop it before he saw what was at the end. But it was his leash. He had bought it. Poor a moment I thought we'd been cut off, Goldman was saying. No, the phone slipped out of my hand, Lewis said. His voice was calm. Did Rachel make it home last night? Oh yes, Lewis said, thinking of the blue car, Church perched on top of it, the blue car that was so still. His eye traced the muddy footprints on the floor. I ought to speak to her, Goldman said. Right away. Eyes about Eileen. Ellie? What about Ellie? I really think Rachel Rachel's not here right now, Lewis said harshly. She's gone to the store for bread and milk. What about Ellie? Come on, Irwin. We had to take her to the hospital, Goldman said reluctantly. She had a bad dream or a whole series of them. She was hysterical and wouldn't come out of it. Did they sedate her? What? Sedation, Lewis said impatiently. Did they give her sedation? Yes, oh yes. They gave her a pill, and she went back to sleep. Did she say anything? What scared her so badly? He was gripping the phone white-knuckled now. Silence from Irwin Goldman's end, long silence. Lewis did not interrupt, much as he would have liked to. That was what scared Dory so badly, Irwin said finally. She babbled a lot before she was crying too hard to understand. Dory herself was almost, What did she say? She said Oz the Great and Terrible had killed her mother. Only she didn't say it that way. She said, Oz the Great and Terrible, which was the way our other daughter always used to say it. Our daughter Zelda. Lewis, believe me when I say I would Rachel have asked Rachel this question. But how much have you? And she told Eileen about Zelda and how she died. Lewis had closed his eyes. The world seemed to be rocking gently under his feet, and Goldman's voice had the lost quality of a voice coming through thick mists. You may bear sounds like voices, but they are only the loons down south to Wara Prospect. The sound carries. Lewis, are you there? Is she going to be all right? Lewis asked, his own voice distant. Is Ellie going to be all right? Did you get a prognosis? Delayed shock from the funeral, Goldman said. My own doctor came. Lathrop, a good man, said she had a degree of fever and that when she woke up this afternoon, she might not even remember. But I think Rachel should come back. Lewis, I am frightened. I think you should come back too. Lewis did not respond. The eye of God was on the sparrow, so said good King James. Lewis, however, was a lesser being, and his eye was on those muddy footprints. Lewis, Gage is dead, Goldman was saying. I know that must be hard to accept for you and Rachel both, but your daughter is very much alive, and she needs you. Yes, I accept that. You may be a stupid old fart, Irwin, but perhaps the nightmare that passed between your two daughters on that April day in 1965 taught you something about sensitivity. She needs me, but I can't come, because I'm afraid, so terribly afraid that my bands are filthy with her mother's blood. Lewis regarded those hands. Lewis regarded the dirt under his nails, which was so like the dirt which comprised those footprints on the kitchen floor. All right, he said, I understand. We'll be there as soon as we can, Irwin. By tonight, if that's possible. Thank you. We did the best we could, Goldman said. Maybe we're too old, maybe, Lewis, maybe we always were. Did she say anything else? Lewis asked. Goldman's reply was like the toll of a funeral bell against the wall of his heart. A lot, but only one other thing I could make out. Paxcow says it's too late. He hung up the telephone and moved back toward the stove in a daze, apparently meaning to continue on with breakfast or put the things away, he didn't know which, and about halfway across the kitchen a wave of faintness poured over him. Floating gray overcame his sight, and he swooned to the floor. Swoon was the right word because it seemed to take forever. He fell down through cloudy depths. It seemed to him that he turned over and over, looped the loop, did a dipsy doodle or two, slipped an Immelman. Then he struck on his bad knee and the chromium bolt of pain through his head brought him back with a scream of agony. For a moment he could only crouch, the tears starting from his eyes. At last he made it back to his feet and stood there, swaying. But his head was clear again. That was something, wasn't it? The urge to flee came on him again for the last time, stronger than ever. He actually felt the comforting bulge of his car keys in his pocket. He would get in the Civic and drive to Chicago. He would get Ellie and go on from there. Of course by then Goldman would know something was wrong, that something was dreadfully amiss, but he would get her anyway. Snatch her, if he had to. Then his hand fell away from the bulge of the keys. What killed the urge was not a sense of futility, not guilt, not despair or the deep weariness inside him. It was the sight of those muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. In his mind's eye he could see them tracing a path across the entire country, first to Illinois, then to Florida, across the entire world, if necessary. What you bought, you owned, and what you owned eventually came home to you. There would come a day when he would open a door and there would be Gage, a demented parody of his former self, grinning a sunken grin, his clear blue eyes gone yellow and smart stupid. Or Ellie would open the bathroom door for her morning shower, and there would be Gage in the tub, his body crisscrossed with the faded scars and bulges of his fatal accident, clean but stinking of the grave. Oh yes, that day would come, he didn't doubt it a bit. How could I have been so stupid, he said to the empty room, talking to himself again, not caring. How? Grief, nor stupidity, Lewis. There is a difference, small but viral. The bastard that burying ground survives on. Growing in power, Judd said, and of course B was right, and you're part of its power now. It has fed on your grief. No, more than that. It's doubled it, cubed it, raised it to the nth power. And it isn't just grief it feeds on. Sanity. It's eaten your sanity. The flaw is only the inability to accept, not uncommon. It's cost you your wife, and it's almost surely cost you your best friend as well as your son. This is it. What comes when you're too slow. Wishing away the thing that knocks on your door in the middle of the night is simple enough. Total darkness. I would commit suicide now, he thought, and I suppose it's in the cards, isn't it? I bathe the equipment in my bag. It has managed every TBing, managed it from the first. The burying ground, the Wendigo, whatever it is. It forced our cat into the road, and perhaps it forced Gage into the road as well. It brought Rachel Boehm, but only in its own good time. Surely I'm meant to do that, and I want to. But things have to be put right, don't they? Yes, they did. There was Gage to think about. Gage was still out there, somewhere. He followed the footprints through the dining room and the living room and back up the stairs. They were smudged there because he had walked over them on his way down without seeing them. They led to the bedroom. He was here, Lewis thought wonderingly, he was right here, and then he saw that his medical bag was unsnapped. The contents inside, which he always arranged with careful neatness, were now in jumbled disorder. But it did not take Lewis long to see that his scalpel was missing, and he put his hands over his face and sat that way for some time, a faint, despairing noise coming from his throat. At last he opened the bag again and began to look through it. Downstairs again, the sound of the pantry door being opened, the sound of a cupboard being opened, then slammed shut, the busy whine of the can opener, last the sound of the garage door opening and closing, and then the house stood empty in the May sunshine, as it had stood empty on that August day the year before, waiting for the new people to arrive. As it would wait for other new people to arrive at some future date. A young married couple perhaps, with no children, but with hopes and plans. Bright young marrieds with a taste for Mondavi wine and Lovenbroy beer. He would be in charge of the Northeast Bank's credit department perhaps, she with a dental hygienist's credential or maybe 3 years' experience as an optometrist's assistant. He would split half a cord of wood for the fireplace, she would wear high-waisted corduroy pants and walk in Mrs. Vinton's field, collecting November's fall grasses for a table centerpiece. Her hair in a ponytail, the brightest thing under the gray skies, totally unaware that an invisible vulture rode the air currents overhead. They would congratulate themselves on their lack of superstition, on their hard-headedness ensnaring the house in spite of its history. Che would tell their friends that it had been fire sale priced and joked about the ghost in the attic, and all of them would have another Lovenbroy or another glass of Mondavi, and they would play backgammon or Milbourne. And perhaps they would have a dog. 61 Lewis paused on the soft shoulder to let an Orinco truck loaded with chemical fertilizer blast by him, and then he crossed the street to Judd's house, trailing his shadow to the west behind him. He held an open can of Kalo cat food in one hand. Church saw him crossing and sat up, his eyes watchful. "Hi, Church," Lewis said, surveying the silent house. "Want some grub?" He put the can of cat food down on the trunk of the Chevette and watched as Church leapt lightly down from its roof and began to eat. Lewis put his hand in his jacket pocket. Church looked around at him, tensing, as if reading his mind. Lewis smiled and stepped away from the car. Church began to eat again, and Lewis took a syringe from his pocket. He stripped the paper covering from it and filled it with 75 milligrams of morphine. He put the multidose vial back in his jacket and walked over to Church, who looked around again mistrustfully. Lewis smiled at the cat and said, "Go on, eat up, Church. Hey ho, let's go, Ryer." He stroked the cat, felt its back arch, and when Church went back to his meal again, Lewis seized it around its stinking guts and sank the needle deep into its haunch. Church went electric in his grip, struggling against him, spitting and clawing, but Lewis held on and depressed the plunger all the way. Only then did he let go. The cat leapt off the Chevette, hissing like a tea kettle, yellow-green eyes wild and baleful. The needle and syringe dangled from its haunch as it leapt, then fell out and broke. Lewis was indifferent. He had more of everything. The cat started for the road, then turned back toward the house, as if remembering something. It got halfway there and then began to weave drunkenly. It made the steps, leapt up to the first one, then fell off. It lay on the bare patch at the foot of the porch steps on its side, breathing weakly. Louis glanced into the Chevette. If he had needed more confirmation than the stone that had replaced his heart, he had it. Rachel's purse on the seat, her scarf, and a clutch of plane tickets spilling out of a Delta Airlines folder. When he turned around again to walk to the porch, Church's side had ceased its rapid, fluttery movement. Church was dead. Again, Louis stepped over it and mounted the porch steps. Gage? It was cool in the front hall. Cool and dark. The single word fell into the silence like a stone down a deep-drilled well. Louis threw another. Gage? Nothing. Even the tick of the clock in the parlor had ceased. This morning there had been no one to wind it. But there were tracks on the floor. Louis went into the living room. There was the smell of cigarettes, stale and long since burned out. He saw Judd's chair by the window. It was pushed askew, as if he had gotten up suddenly. There was an ashtray on the windowsill, and in it a neat roll of cigarette ash. Judd sat beer watching. Watching for what? For me, of course, watching for me to come home. Only be missed me. Sumbo be missed me. Louis glanced at the 4 beer cans lined up in a neat row. Not enough to put him to sleep, but maybe he had gotten up to go to the bathroom. However it was just a little bit too good to have been perfectly accidental, wasn't it? The muddy tracks approached the chair by the window. Mixed among the human tracks were a few faded, ghostly cat prints. As if Church had walked in and out of the gravedirt left by Gage's small shoes. Then the tracks made for the swinging door leading into the kitchen. Heart-thudding, Louis followed the tracks. He pushed the door open and saw Judd's splayed feet, his old green work pants, his checked flannel shirt. The old man was lying sprawled in a wide pool of drying blood. Louis glanced his hands to his face, as if to blight his own vision. But there was no way to do that. He saw eyes, Judd's eyes, open, accusing him, perhaps even accusing himself for setting this in motion. But did B? Louis wondered. Did B really do that? Judd had been told by Stanny B, and Stanny B had been told by his father, and Stanny B's father had been told by his father, the last traitor to the Indians. A Frenchman from the North Country in the days when Franklin Pierce had been a living president. "Oh Judd, I'm so sorry," he whispered. Judd's blank eyes stared at him. "So sorry," Louis repeated. His feet seemed to move by themselves, and he was suddenly back to last Thanksgiving in his mind, not to that night when B. and Judd had taken Che car up Co the pet cemetery and beyond, but to the turkey dinner Norma had put on the table, all of them laughing and talking, the 2 men drinking beer and Norma with a glass of white wine, and she had taken the white lawn tablecloth from the lower drawer as he was taking it now, but she had put it on the table and then anchored it with lovely pewter candlestick holders, while Louis watched it billow down over Judd's body like a collapsing parachute, mercifully covering that dead face. Almost immediately, tiny rose petals of deepest, darkest scarlet began to stain the white lawn. "I'm sorry," he said for a 3rd time. "So sore right pointing arrow." Then something moved overhead, something scraped, and the word broke off between the lips. It had been soft, it had been stealthy, but it had been deliberate. Oh yes, he was convinced of that. A sound he had been meant to hear. His hands wanted to tremble, but he would not allow them. He stepped over to the kitchen table with its checkered oilcloth covering and reached into his pocket. He removed 3 more Becton Dickinson syringes, stripped them of their paper coverings, and laid them out in a neat row. He removed 3 more multi-dose vials and filled each of the syringes with enough morphine to kill a horse, or Hanratty the bull, if it came to that. He put them in his pocket again. He left the kitchen, crossed the living room, and stood at the base of the stairs. Gage? From somewhere in the shadows above there came a giggling, a cold and sunless laughter that made the skin on Louis's back prickle. He started up. It was a long walk to the top of those stairs. He could well imagine a condemned man taking a walk almost as long, and as horribly short, to the platform of a scaffold with his hands tied behind his back, knowing that he would piss when he could no longer whistle. He reached the top at last, one hand in his pocket, staring only at the wall. How long did he stand that way? He did not know. He could now feel his sanity beginning to give way. This was an actual sensation, a true thing, it was interesting. He imagined a tree overloaded with ice in a terrible storm would feel this way if trees could feel anything, shortly before toppling. It was interesting, and it was sort of amusing. Gage, want to go to Florida with me? That giggle again. Lewis turned and was greeted by the sight of his wife, to whom he had once carried a rose in his teeth, lying halfway down the hall, dead. Her legs were splayed out as Judd's had been. Her back and head were cocked at an angle against the wall. She looked like a woman who had gone to sleep while reading in bed. He walked down toward her. Hello, darling, he thought, you came boom. Blood had splashed the wallpaper in idiot shapes. She had been stabbed a dozen times, 24, who knew? His scalpel had done this work. Suddenly he saw her, really saw her, and Louis Creed began to scream. His screams echoed and racketed shrilly through this house where now only dead lived and walked. Eyes bulging, face livid, hair standing on end, he screamed. The sounds came from his swollen throat like the bells of hell, terrible shrieks that signaled the end not of love but of sanity. In his mind all the hideous images were suddenly unloosed at once. Victor Pascow dying on the infirmary carpet, Church coming back with bits of green plastic in his whiskers. Gage's baseball cap lying in the road, full of blood, but most of all that thing he had seen near Little God Swamp, the thing that had pushed the tree over, the thing with the yellow eyes, the Wendigo, creature of the North Country, the dead thing whose touch awakens unspeakable appetites. Rachel had not just been killed. Something had been at her. Opening parenthesis exclamation mark. Click. That click was in his head. It was the sound of some relay fusing and burning out forever, the sound of lightning stroking down in a direct hit, the sound of a door opening. Now Gage looked up at him and for a moment Louis saw his son, his real son, his face unhappy and filled with pain. "Daddy," he cried, and then fell forward on his face. Louis stood there for a moment, then went to Gage, moving carefully, expecting some trick. But there was no trick, no sudden leap with clawed hands. He slid his fingers expertly down Gage's throat, found the pulse, and held it. He was then a doctor for the last time in his life, monitoring the pulse, monitoring until there was nothing inside, nothing outside. When it was gone at last, Louis got up and sauntered down the hall to a far corner. He crouched there, pulling himself into a ball, cramming himself into the corner, tighter and tighter. He found he could make himself smaller if he put a thumb in his mouth, and so he did that. He remained that way for better than 2 hours, and then, little by little, a dark and oh so plausible idea came to him. He pulled his thumb from his mouth. It made a small pop. Louis got himself, "Babe-bo, let's go," going again. In the room where Gage had hidden, he stripped the sheet from the bed and took it out into the hall. He wrapped his wife's body in it, gently, with love. He was humming but did not realize it. He found gasoline in Judd's garage. 5 gallons of it in a red can next to the lawnboy. More than enough. He began in the kitchen where Judd still lay under the Thanksgiving tablecloth. He drenched that, then moved into the living room with the can still appended, spraying amber gas over the rug, the sofa, the magazine rack, the chairs, and so out into the downstairs hall and toward the back bedroom. The smell of gas was strong and rich. Judd's matches were by the chair where he had kept his fruitless watch, on top of his cigarettes. Louis took them. At the front door he tossed a lighted match back over his shoulder and stepped out. The blast of the heat was immediate and savage, making the skin on his neck feel too small. He shut the door neatly and only stood on the porch for a moment, watching the orange flickers behind Norma's curtains. Then he crossed the porch, pausing for a moment, remembering the beers he and Judd had drunk here a million years ago, listening to the soft, gathering roar of fire within the house. Then he stepped out. 62. Steve Masterton came around the curve just before Louis's house and saw the smoke immediately, not from Louis's place, but from the house that belonged to the old duck across the street. He had come out this morning because he had been worried about Louis, deeply worried. Charlton had told him about Rachel's call of the day before, and that had set him to wondering just where Louis was, and what he was up to. His worry was vague, but it itched at his mind. He wasn't going to feel right until he had gone out there and checked to see if things were okay. or as okay as they could be under the circumstances. The spring weather had emptied the infirmary like white magic, and Surendra had told him to go ahead, he could handle whatever came up. So Steve had jumped into his Honda, which he had liberated from the garage only last weekend, and headed out for Ludlow. Maybe he pushed the cycle a little faster than was strictly necessary, but the worry was there, it gnawed. And with it came the absurd feeling that he was already too late. Stupid, of course, but in the pit of his stomach there was a feeling similar to the one he'd had there last fall when that Pascal thing cropped up. A feeling of miserable surprise and almost leaden disillusion. He was by no means a religious man. In college Steve had been a member of the Atheist Society for 2 semesters and had dropped out only when his advisor had told him privately and very much off the record that it might hurt his chances to obtain a med school scholarship later on. But he supposed he fell as much heir to whatever biological or biorhythmic conditions passed for premonitions as any other human being, and the death of Pascal had seemed to set a tone for the year which followed, somehow. Not a good year by any means. Ewo of Surendra's relatives had been clapped in jail back home, some political thing, and Surendra had told him that he believed one of them, an uncle he cared for very much, might well now be dead. Surendra had wept, and the tears from the usually benign Indian had frightened Steve. And Charlton's mother had had a radical mastectomy. The tough nurse was not very optimistic about her mother's chances for joining the 5-year club. Steve himself had attended 4 funerals since the death of Victor Pascal, his wife's sister, killed in a car crash, a cousin, killed in a freak accident as the result of a barroom bet, he had been electrocuted while proving he could shinny all the way to the top of a power pole, a grandparent, and of course Louis's little boy. He liked Louis enormously, and he wanted to make sure Louis was all right. Louis had been through hell lately. When he saw the billows of smoke, his first thought was that this was something else to lay at the door of Victor Pascal, who seemed, in his dying, to have removed some sort of crash barrier between these ordinary people and an extraordinary run of bad luck. But that was stupid, and Louis's house was the proof. It stood calm and white, a little piece of clean-limbed New England architecture in the mid-morning sun. People were running toward the old Duck's house, and as Steve banked his bike across the road and pulled into Louis's driveway, he saw a man dash up onto the old Duck's porch, approach the front door, and then retreat. It was well that he did. A moment later the glass pane in the center of the door blew out, and flames boiled through the opening. If the fool actually had gotten the door open, the blowout would have cooked him like a lobster. Steve dismounted and put the Honda on its kickstand, Lowe's momentarily forgotten. He was drawn by all the old mystery of fire. Maybe half a dozen people had gathered, except for the would-be hero, who lingered on the Crandall's lawn. They kept a respectful distance. Now the windows between the porch and the house blew out. Glass danced in the air. The would-be hero ducked and ran for it. Flames ran up the inner wall of the porch like groping hands, blistering the white paint. As Steve watched, one of the Rajon easy chairs smoldered and then exploded into flame. Over the crackling sounds, he heard the would-be hero cry out with a shrill and absurd sort of optimism. "Gonna lose her. Gonna lose her sure. If Judd's there, he's a gone goose. Told I am about the creosote in that chimbley 100 times." Steve opened his mouth to holler across and ask if the fire department had been called, but just then he heard the faint wail of sirens, approaching. A lot of them. They had been called, but the would-be hero was right. The house was going. Flames probed through half a dozen broken windows now, and the front eave had grown an almost transparent membrane of fire over its bright green shingles. He turned back, then, remembering Louis, but if Louis were here, wouldn't he be with the others across the street? Steve caught something then, just barely caught it with the tail of his eye. Beyond the head of Louis's hot-topped driveway there was a field that stretched up a long, gently rising hill. The timothy grass, although still green, had grown high already this May, but Steve could see a path, almost as neatly mowed as a putting green on a golf course. It wound and meandered its way up the slope of the field, rising to meet the woods that began, thick and green, just below the horizon. It was here, where the pale green of the timothy grass met the thicker, denser green of the woods, that Steve had seen movement, a flash of bright white that seemed to be moving. It was gone almost as soon as his eye registered it, but it had seemed to him for that brief moment that he had seen a man carrying a white bundle. That was Lewis, his mind told him with sudden irrational certainty. That was Lewis, and you better get to him quick because something damn bad has happened and pretty quick, something even moan damn bad is going to boppin' if you don't stop bim. He stood indecisively at the head of the driveway, shifting one foot for the other, his weight jittery between the two of them. Steve baby, you're scared shirtless just a booze now, aren't you? Yes, he was. He was scared shitless and for no reason at all, but there was also a certain attraction, yes. A creation attraction here, something about that path leading up the hill and perhaps continuing on into the woods. Surely that path had to go somewhere, didn't it? Yes, of course it did. All paths eventually went somewhere. Lewis. Don't forget about Lewis, you dummy. Lewis was the man you came out to see, remember? You didn't come out to Ludlow to go exploring the goddamn woods. What you got there, Randy, the would-be hero cried. His voice, still shrill and somehow optimistic, carried well. Randy's reply was almost but not quite obscured by the growing wail of the fire sirens. Dead cat. Burnt up? Don't look burnt, Randy returned. Just looks dead. And Steve's mind returned implacably, as if the exchange across the street had something to do with what he had seen. What he thought he had seen. That was Lewis. He started to move then, trotting up the path toward the woods, leaving the fire behind him. He had worked up a good sweat by the time he reached the edge of the woods, and the shade felt cool and good. There was the sweet aroma of pine and spruce, bark and sap. Once into the woods he broke into an all-out run, not sure why he was running, not sure why his heart was beating double time. His breath whistled in and out. He was able to lengthen his run to a sprint going downhill. The path was admirably clear. He reached the arch that marked the entrance to the pet cemetery at little more than a fast walk. There was a hot stitch high in his right side, just under the armpit. His eyes barely registered the circles of graves, the beaten tim squares, the bits of board and slate. His gaze was fixed on the bizarre sight at the far side of the circular clearing. It was fixed on Lewis, who was climbing a deadfall, seemingly in outright defiance of gravity. He mounted the steep fall step by step, his eyes straight ahead. Like a man who has been mesmerized or who is sleepwalking. In his arms was the white thing that Steve had seen from the tail of his eye. This close, its configuration was undeniable. It was a body. One foot, clad in a black shoe with a low heel, protruded. And Steve knew with a sudden and sickening certainty that Lewis was carrying Rachel's body. Lewis's hair had gone white. Lewis! Steve screamed. Lewis didn't hesitate, didn't pause. He reached the top of the deadfall and began down the far side. He'll fall, Steve thought incoherently. He's been damned lucky, incredibly lucky, but pretty soon he's going to fall, and if his leg's the only thing he breaks. But Lewis did not fall. He reached the other side of the deadfall, was temporarily out of Steve's sight, and then reappeared as he walked toward the woods again. Lewis! Steve yelled again. This time Lewis stopped and turned back. Steve was struck dumb by what he saw. Besides the white hair, Lewis's face was that of an old man. At first there was no recognition at all in Lewis's face. It dawned little by little, as if someone was turning a rheostat up in his brain. Lewis's mouth was twitching. After a while Steve realized that Lewis was trying to smile. Steve, he said in a cracked, uncertain voice. Hello, Steve. I'm going to bury her. Have to do it with my bare hands, I guess. It may take until dark. The soil up there is very stony. I don't suppose you'd want to give me a hand? Steve opened his mouth, but no words came out. In spite of his surprise, in spite of his horror, he did want to give Lewis a hand. Somehow, up here in the woods, it seemed very right, very natural. Lewis, he managed to croak at last, what happened? Good Christ, what happened? Was she in the fire? I waited too long with Gage, Lewis said. Something got into him because I waited too long. But it will be different with Rachel, Steve. I know it will. He staggered a little, and Steve saw that Lewis had gone insane. He saw this quite clearly. Lewis was insane and abysmally weary. But somehow only the latter seemed to carry weight in his own bewildered mind. I could use some help, Lewis said. Luce, even if I wanted to help you, I couldn't climb over that pile of wood. Oh yes, Lewis said. You could. If you just move steadily and don't look down. That's the secret, Steve. He turned then, and although Steve called his name, Lewis moved off into the woods. For a few moments Steve could see the white of the sheet flickering through the trees. Then it was gone. He ran across to the deadfall and began to climb it with no thought at all, at first feeling with his hands for good holds, attempting to crawl up it, and then gaining his feet. As he did so, a crazy daredevil exhilaration swept over him. It was like hitting on pure oxygen. He believed he could do it, and he did. Moving swiftly and surely, he reached the top. He stood there for a moment, swaying, watching Lewis move along the path which continued on the far side of the deadfall. Lewis turned and looked back at Steve. He held his wife, wrapped in a bloody sheet, in his arms. You may hear sounds, Lewis said. Sounds like voices. But they are just the loons, down south toward Prospect. The sound carries. It's funny, Lewis _. But Lewis had turned away. For a moment Steve almost followed him. It was very, very close. I could help Bim, if that's what he wants, and I want to help Bim, yes. That's the truth because there's more going on here than meets the eye and I want to know what it is. It seems very, well, very important. It seems like a secret. Like a mystery. Then a branch snapped under one of his canted feet. It made a dry, dusty sound like a track starter's gun. It brought him back to exactly where he was and what he was doing. Terror leapt into him and he turned around in a clumsy circle, arms held out for balance, his conge and throat oily with fright, his face bearing the dismayed grimace of a man who wakes up only to find he has sleepwalked his way onto a high skyscraper ledge. She's dead and I think that maybe Lewis has killed Beer. Lewis has gone mad, utterly mad, but there was something worse than madness here, something much, much worse. It was as if there was a magnet somewhere in those woods and he could feel it pulling at something in his brain. Pulling him toward that place where Lewis was taking Rachel. Come on, walk the path. Walk the path and see where it goes. We got stuff to show you out Beer, Steverino, stuff they never told you about in the Atheist Society back in Lake Forest. And then, perhaps simply because it had enough for one day to feed on and lost interest in him, the call of the place in his mind simply ceased. Steve took 2 plunging, drunken steps back down the side of the downfall. Then more branches let go with a grinding rattle and his left foot plunged into the tangled dead wood. Harsh sharp splinters pulled off his sneaker and then tore into his flesh as he yanked free. He fell forward into the pet cemetery, barely missing a piece of orange crate that could easily have punched into his stomach. He got to his feet, staring around, bewildered, wondering what had happened to him, or if anything had happened to him. Already it had begun to seem like a dream. Then, from the deep woods behind the deadfall, woods so deep that the light looked green and tarnished even on the brightest days, a low, chuckling laugh arose. The sound was huge. Steve could not even begin to imagine what sort of creature could have made such a sound. He ran, one shoe off and one shoe on, trying to shriek but unable. He was still running when he reached Lewis's house, and still trying to shriek when he finally got his bike started and slewed onto Route 15. He very nearly sideswiped an arriving fire engine from Brewer. Inside his bell helmet, his hair was standing on end. By the time he got back to his apartment in Orono, he could not precisely remember having gone to Ludlow at all. He called in sick at the infirmary, took a pill, and went to bed. Steve Masterton never really remembered that day. Except in deep dreams, those that come in the small hours of the morning. And in these dreams he would sense that something huge had shrugged by him, something which had reached out to touch him, and had then withdrawn its inhuman hand at the very last second. Something with great yellow eyes which gleamed like fog lamps. Steve sometimes awoke shrieking from these dreams, his eyes wide and bulging, and he would think, "You think you are screaming, but it's only the sound of the loons, down south, in Prospect." The sound carries. It's funny. But he did not know, could not remember, what such a thought might mean. The following year he took a job halfway across the country, in St. Louis. In the time between his last sight of Louis Creed and his departure for the Midwest, Steve never went into the town of Ludlow again. Epilogue. The police came that afternoon. They asked questions but voiced no suspicions. The ashes were still hot. They had not yet the police came Lair Thar afterno, Theos Cadio but been raked. Louis answered their questions. They seemed satisfied. They spoke outside and he wore a hat. That was good. If they had seen his gray hair, they might have asked more case tions. That would have been bad. He wore his gardening gloves, and that was good too. His hands were bloody and ruined. He played solitaire that night until long after midnight. He was just dealing a fresh hand when he heard the back door open. What you buy is what you own, and sooner or later what you own will come back to you, Louis Creed thought. He did not turn around but only looked at his cards as the slow, gritting footsteps approached. He saw the Queen of Spades. He put his hand on it. The steps ended directly behind him. Silence. A cold hand fell on Louis's shoulder. Rachel's voice was grating, full of dirt. "Darling," it said. February 1979 to December 1982.